The radio on Deputy Ray Cullen's belt crackled once and went quiet, and he didn't reach for it. He was standing with his flashlight angled at the woman's window, and she just said the thing that people say when they've got no real card to play. He'd heard it before, different versions of it said in the same tone. I know somebody, I have connections, you don't want to do this. This version was, Deputy, I'm going to need you to understand that I am a federal law enforcement officer, and this stop is going to create some significant paperwork for both of us. Ray let the silence sit for a second, the flashlight didn't move. License and registration, he said. She looked at him in that particular way, not angry, not nervous, which was itself unusual, and reached for the glove compartment without a word. The car was a dark gray Honda Accord, maybe 4 years old, clean inside. No air freshener, no food wrappers, a gym bag behind the passenger seat, and a laptop case on the floor. She moved with the practiced, unhurried economy of someone who wasn't searching. She knew exactly where the documents were. She handed them over. Ray walked the license back to his cruiser, the gravel of the shoulder crunching under his boots. The night was warm in the way that July in southeastern Oklahoma is always warm, thick, close, the kind of air that sits on your skin like a damp cloth. The tree line on both sides of US 270 was black against a paler sky, and off to the east, maybe 10 miles, the scattered lights of McAlester made a low amber smear along the horizon. He ran the license through dispatch. Dana Lynn Marsh, Tulsa address, clean record, not just a few minor things smoothed over, actually clean. He tapped his thumb on the steering wheel. He hadn't clocked her with radar. He'd pulled her because she was doing exactly 55 in a 55, and something about that bothered him, the too careful driving, the deliberate compliance, though he couldn't have articulated it in any way that would hold up. He'd been sitting in his cruiser in the lot of the closed Dollar General since about 9:30, which was what he did most evenings when things were quiet in Hartshorn, and when the gray Accord drifted past with its signal on well before the turn, he'd found himself pulling out behind it just to see. He walked back to her window. Ms. Marsh, he said, where you headed tonight? McAlester? She was looking straight ahead, both hands on the wheel, which people didn't usually do unless they'd been taught that specifically. Coming from where? Tulsa. That's a long way to drive at night. I don't mind driving at night. Ray shone the flashlight past her, slow arc across the back seat and the gym bag. You said you're a federal officer. I did. You want to show me something that says that? She turned to look at him then, not hostility, something more like assessment. She was maybe 35, brown hair pulled back, wearing a navy pullover despite the heat. No jewelry. She had the kind of face that didn't give you much to read, which he took incorrectly as defensiveness. She reached into the center console and produced a credential wallet. She held it up to the flashlight beam. The gold badge, the blue card, the photograph, the seal, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special agent, she said, not like she was proud of it, more like she was identifying an object. Ray looked at it for 3 full seconds, then, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Ray Cullen had worked Pittsburgh County for 11 years and had been a deputy for 9 of them, after 2 years as a patrol officer in McAlester proper, which he considered his apprenticeship in nothing very useful. He was 43, slightly overweight in the way of a man who had once been genuinely fit and hadn't caught up with the fact that he wasn't anymore. He had a wife in Krebs he barely spoke to and a son at Oklahoma State he barely knew, and he handled both of those facts by not handling them. He was not a cruel man, that's important. He wasn't the kind of deputy who looked for reasons. He didn't enjoy putting his boot on someone's neck. He had a temper that came and went, and there were maybe 3 incidents in 11 years where a use of force review board might have looked twice at something he'd done, and in 2 of those cases the charges against the arrested individuals were serious enough that no one looked very hard. What he was, specifically, was a man who had spent 11 years being the most significant authority in a 20-mile radius of Hartshorn, and who had over those 11 years come to experience that authority as something close to natural law. Not arrogance, exactly. Something quieter and more settled than arrogance. A man who had come to believe that the hierarchy of things, the order in which the world arranged its people and its power, simply placed him at a certain level, and that this placement was appropriate and earned, and that challenges to it were therefore inherently suspicious. When he asked Dana Marsh to step out of the vehicle, he was not thinking about any of this. He was thinking that the badge looked real, that it was probably real, and that she was probably exactly who she said she was, and that she was also on his road on his shift, and that the credential didn't change any of that. She stepped out of the car. She was shorter than she'd seemed sitting down. She stood with her arms slightly away from her sides, not raised, just clear of her body, and she looked at him with that same measuring expression and waited. "You have a weapon on you." "Yes, Glock 19, right hip inside the waistband. I'm not going to reach for it." "What's your business in McAllister?" "I'm not going to discuss my business with you, deputy." "You're not going to?" "No," she said, not rudely, not with any particular emphasis, just the flat factual word. Ray clicked his tongue. He walked a half circle behind her, looking at the car, then back at her. "I can call this in." "You should," she said. "You can reach the Oklahoma City field office at." "I know how to reach the FBI." "Then you should do that." He didn't do it right away. He stood there for a moment with his thumb hooked in his belt, and the radio on his hip made a soft burst of static, and someone's voice said something about a domestic over in Alderson, and he waited until that passed. The thing he would not have been able to say, standing there in the heat on US 270, was that he'd already decided. He didn't consciously know he'd decided. He would have said he was still assessing the situation, weighing his options, exercising appropriate caution and procedure. But some part of him, the part that had been in this county for 11 years, the part that watched the road from an empty parking lot until 10:30 most nights, that part had already moved past the credential, past the steady eyes and the careful hands, and was operating on a different set of data entirely. She was a woman driving alone on a rural highway at 9:45 at night. She had been doing exactly the speed limit, which still bothered him in a way he couldn't name. And she had told him what she was, rather than answering his question about her destination. Those things didn't add up to anything except that they didn't add up, and that was enough. "Turn around and put your hands on the roof of the vehicle," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face, not fear, not anger, something closer to a decision being made. "Deputy Cullen," she said, "before you do this, I want you to understand that I am asking you, clearly and on the record, to contact your supervisor and the Oklahoma City field office. I am identifying myself as a federal agent. If you proceed without doing that, whatever happens next is going to be much more complicated than it needs to be." "Hands on the roof." She turned around and put her hands on the roof of the car. It took Ray about 40 seconds to determine that she was not carrying anything other than the Glock, which he unholstered and placed on the trunk of the Accord, and a small folding knife in her left front pocket, and a phone and a leather notebook. He inventoried these items by voice for his body camera, calling each one out as he set it on the trunk, professional and precise in the way he usually was during a stop. He put her in the back of his cruiser. She sat with her wrists zip-tied in front of her, not behind, which was a small thing, a tiny accommodation he made almost unconsciously, and she looked out the side window at the tree line. She didn't say anything else. She wasn't crying. She wasn't visibly angry. She was just sitting there in the way that Ray, in his 11 years, had come to associate with people who were not what they appeared. He called it in. 471 to dispatch, 10:15 on a Dana Lynn Marsh F. White DOB, April 12, 1988, Tulsa address. He read the address from the license. "Requesting want warrant check." Dispatch came back clean inside of 2 minutes. He called Sergeant Dale Whitfield, who was his shift supervisor and who answered on the fourth ring with the particular flatness of a man who has been half asleep in a recliner. "I got a woman in custody on 270, Ray said, pulled her over for a moving violation. There had been, technically, a moment where her left tires had touched the fog line, which he had noted at the time and forgotten about until now. She's claiming to be FBI. Whitfield was quiet for a moment, claiming. "Showed a credential, looks real." Ray, another pause. "Did you call the field office?" "Not yet." "Call the field office." Ray called the Oklahoma City field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation at 9:56 p.m. The duty agent he reached was a man named Kowalski, who asked him to repeat the name twice and then put him on hold for 4 minutes. When Kowalski came back, his voice had changed in a small but noticeable way. "Can you tell me your current location, deputy?" Ray told him. "And Special Agent Marsh is in your custody." "Special Agent Marsh, not the woman you're describing or an individual claiming to be." Kowalski had said it the way you say the name of someone you know. "She's in my vehicle," Ray said. "I need you to release her, deputy. Right now, I'm going to stay on the line." Ray looked in the rearview mirror. Dana Marsh was watching him. Her expression hadn't changed. She was driving erratically, Ray said. Deputy. I have grounds for the stop. I'm processing her through the system and then I'll release her. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted about 4 seconds. I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, Kowalski said, and his voice had gone very quiet and very even, the way you speak to something that might bolt if startled. You need to release her right now. This is not a negotiation. I appreciate that, Ray said, but procedure is procedure. He drove Dana Marsh to the Pittsburgh County Sheriff's substation in Hartshorne, which was a beige concrete block building on a 2-lane road behind the Dollar General, and he processed her in. The booking officer that night was a part-time deputy named Marcus Good, who was 26 and had been on the job for 8 months, and who looked at the credential wallet Ray handed him and then looked at Ray and then looked at the credential wallet again. Ray, Good said. Enter it in. This is an FBI badge. I can see that, Marcus. Good opened his mouth and then closed it. He typed. He asked Dana Marsh, standing at the booking counter with her wrists still zip-tied, for her fingerprints. She gave them without comment. He asked her the standard medical intake questions. She answered in short, level sentences. She had been arrested twice before, which surprised Good until he looked more closely and saw that both were job-related. A training exercise and an undercover operation that had required an in-custody period for cover purposes. She was placed in a holding cell that currently contained no other occupants. The cell was 8 feet by 10 concrete block, with a metal bench along one wall and a toilet in the corner and a fluorescent tube overhead that hummed at a constant middle frequency. It smelled like bleach and something underneath the bleach. Dana Marsh sat on the bench and folded her hands in her lap and tilted her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. In the 11 years since he'd started in Pittsburgh County, Ray Cullen had processed a lot of people through a lot of holding cells, and most of them, even the ones who were calm on the outside, betrayed something when the cell door closed. A tightening around the mouth, a shift in the shoulders, eyes that tracked the door for a moment too long. Dana Marsh did none of these things. She sat on the metal bench like a woman sitting in a waiting room, mildly inconvenienced, not particularly concerned. Ray stood at the cell door for a few seconds longer than he needed to. Then he walked to his desk and called his shift supervisor again. Dale Whitfield arrived at the substation at 11:15, and he came in through the side door and walked directly to Ray's desk and stood there with his arms crossed and said, "Walk me through it." Ray walked him through it. The stop, the license, the credential, the call to dispatch, the call to the field office. He kept his voice steady and procedural, the same way he'd told it to himself in his head on the drive back. The moving violation. The credential he couldn't verify in the field. The duty agent who had identified her, yes, but who had declined to provide any information about what a federal agent was doing on a rural highway at night. Kowalski told you to release her. He did. And you brought her in. She was on my road on my shift. I had a lawful stop. Ray, Whitfield uncrossed his arms. He had been doing this job for 20 years and he had a specific look he put on when something was going sideways, not anger but a careful attentiveness, and he was wearing it now. Have you considered that she might actually be FBI? I know she's FBI, that doesn't change the stop. It changes about 50 other things. Whitfield pinched the bridge of his nose. I'm releasing her. That's your call to make. Yes, Whitfield said, it is. Ray sat at his desk and listened to the sound of the cell block door opening, Whitfield's voice, Dana Marsh's level responses, the front door of the substation. He didn't turn around. He was filling out the incident report, which he was going to need to make very clean and very clear, and he was concentrating on that. What he did not know, sitting at his desk at 11:32 p.m. in Hartshorne, Oklahoma, was that Dana Marsh had been in Pittsburgh County for 6 weeks. He did not know that she had been stationed out of a rented house on the eastern side of McAlester under the name Dana Lindley, or that she drove a gray Accord registered to a woman named Patricia Morrow, who was not a real person, or that she had in the preceding 6 weeks made contact with 17 individuals across 3 counties in connection with a federal investigation that had begun in the Tulsa field office 18 months earlier. He did not know that 2 of those 17 individuals were currently cooperating witnesses. He did not know that one of them was a man named Gerald Pruitt, who ran a check-cashing business on the south end of McAlester, and who had, over the previous 3 years, laundered approximately $2.4 million in proceeds from a methamphetamine distribution network that stretched from Pittsburgh County north to Muskogee. He did not know that the investigation had a name, which was Operation Dry Creek, or that it had a case agent in Tulsa named Renfro who had fought for 14 months to get the resources to staff it properly, or that Dana Marsh was Renfro's most experienced field agent and had been specifically requested for this assignment because she had grown up in a small town in rural Missouri and understood from the inside how small-town institutional relationships worked. He did not know that 3 weeks earlier, in a sealed filing in the Northern District of Oklahoma, the names of several individuals had appeared in a warrant application. He did not know that one of those names was his. 3 days after the traffic stop, Ray Cullen came in for his shift and found that his key card no longer worked on the door to the evidence room. He stood in the hallway for a moment, tried it again, then walked to the front desk and asked the day shift officer, Patris, if there was a system problem. Patris was a compact woman in her 50s who had worked the desk for 12 years and who liked Ray Cullen moderately and his recent conduct not at all, and she told him that she wasn't aware of any system problem. Ray went to his desk and pulled up his email and found a message from the county's Human Resources Director asking him to report to the sheriff's main office in McAlester at 9 a.m. the following day for an administrative meeting. The message was brief and used the particular HR phrasing that sounded neutral but wasn't. He read it twice and then went to get coffee and stood at the window that looked out onto the parking lot, where the morning was already bright and already hot, the kind of July morning that promised by midday to be punishing. The thing that went through his mind was not guilt, exactly. It was something more like a rapid reordering of information, events he had cataloged as separate and finished that were now being rearranged by some other hand into a different story. Gerald Pruitt, who Ray had known for 6 years and who had told him over the 3 most recent of those years that he could occasionally count on Ray to overlook certain things in exchange for certain other things. Small things initially. A tip about a missing property complaint that would have led to an embarrassing disclosure for one of Pruitt's associates. A set of impound records that had needed to be kept quiet. $200 here, $300 there, nothing that felt like it had a specific gravity until suddenly you added it all up and the gravity was considerable. Ray was not stupid. He had known for some time that what he was doing with Pruitt existed in a category that, if examined carefully, would not survive examination. He had not examined it carefully. He had instead maintained the belief that small things remain small, that the particular quality of the transactions, their informality, their mutual convenience, their lack of anything that looked like a formal arrangement, constituted a kind of protection. He stood at the window and drank his coffee and thought about the gray Accord on US 270 and the woman who had looked at him from the back of his cruiser with the expression that was not fear and not anger. He went back to his desk and called his brother-in-law, who was a civil attorney in Oklahoma City, and asked him for the name of a good criminal defense lawyer. The administrative meeting at the sheriff's office lasted 22 minutes. Ray sat across from Sheriff Dennis Carver, who had been sheriff of Pittsburgh County for 8 years and was a large, quiet man who had always treated Ray with a kind of neutral collegiality, not warmth but solid professional respect. Carver had a manila folder in front of him on the desk that he didn't open during the meeting. The county's HR director, a woman named Brenda, sat to Carver's left with a laptop and a notepad and said almost nothing. An attorney Ray didn't recognize sat against the wall behind Carver and also said almost nothing. Carver told Ray that he was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into conduct related to the stop and detention of Special Agent Dana Marsh on the evening of July 9th. He said this in the flat, careful language of someone reading from an internal script, and he kept his eyes on Ray the whole time. Ray's service weapon was collected. His body camera footage from the night of the stop had already been transferred and was no longer on the department's server, which Ray didn't learn until later, when his attorney inquired and was told by the county's IT department that the footage had been requested by the FBI's Oklahoma City field office on July 10th, which was the day after the stop. Ray drove home from McAlester in the late morning heat and sat in his driveway for a while before going inside. The investigation into Ray Cullen had actually begun in February, 6 months before the traffic stop, when a confidential informant with ties to Gerald Pruitt's operation had told a DEA contact in Tulsa that there was a Pittsburgh County deputy who made certain things go away. The CI couldn't provide specifics at that point, names, dates, documented transactions, so the information sat for 2 months before it was passed to the FBI and eventually to the Operation Dry Creek case file, which was already building toward Pruitt from the financial side. Dana Marsh had not been driving from Tulsa to McAlester on the night of July 9th. She had been driving from a parking lot 3 miles south of Hartshorn, where she had spent 2 hours in a surveillance position observing a warehouse that Prout's network used for secondary storage. She had documented the visit of 2 vehicles she didn't yet have IDs for, and she had a camera in the back seat of the Accord with about 140 photographs on it. When Ray pulled her over, those photographs were still on the camera, and the camera was in a bag in the back seat. When Ray walked her back to his cruiser and left her there while he stood looking at the Accord, he'd stood there for about 4 minutes, which was on the body cam footage, and what he'd done with those 4 minutes was look at the car with the careful, systematic attention of someone who has looked at a lot of cars. He had seen the bag. He hadn't opened it. There was nothing in the footage that showed him opening it. But the bag had been zipped when Dana got in the car, and when she was released and returned to the Accord, the bag was still zipped and the camera was still inside. She had checked, she always checked. The camera was fine. The photographs were fine. The stop had cost her 3 hours and would require her to write a report she didn't want to write, and it had possibly compromised her cover to some degree, though she'd been careful and Hartshorn was small enough that a deputy seeing an out-of county face probably wouldn't map directly back to anything. What the stop had actually done, what Ray Cullen, standing on US 270 with his flashlight and his slow, systematic certainty had actually accomplished, was provide the investigation with something it needed. Because Dana Marsh's detention was now a federal matter. It was documented, time-stamped, witnessed by a booking officer and a shift supervisor, and it had generated a paper trail that intersected, in several places, with records from Prout's business that the investigation had been working to connect. The pattern, once it became visible, was not subtle. It was just the kind of thing that required time and resources and the willingness to sit in a parking lot in the dark and watch. Ray's attorney was a man named Philip Stout, who operated out of a wood-paneled office in downtown McAlester, and who had spent 23 years doing criminal defense work in eastern Oklahoma. He was 58, unhurried with heavy-framed glasses and a habit of pausing before answering questions that Ray initially mistook for uncertainty and eventually understood was something else. They met 3 times in the 2 weeks following Ray's administrative leave. In the second meeting, Stout told Ray in his unhurried way that the federal investigation was significantly broader than the traffic stop, that the traffic stop was, in fact, the smallest thing Ray was currently looking at. How broad, Ray said. I don't have full visibility yet, but I'm told 3 years, approximately. Ray was quiet. You want to tell me about Gerald Prout, Stout said. I want to know what they have. I want to know what you have, that's the more useful conversation. Ray looked at the wood paneling. It was the kind of paneling that had been fashionable in offices in the 1980s and now just looked like a thing that hadn't been updated. He thought about the warehouse. The vehicles he'd waved through twice in the past year because Prout had texted him a license plate and said that one's mine, leave it. He thought about the cash, which at this point totaled somewhere in the range of $14,000 or $15,000, paid in increments over 3 years, none of it documented anywhere that he was aware of. He thought about the woman sitting in the back of his cruiser. He paid me, Ray said, to not look at certain things. Stout nodded slowly. How much certainly? Ray told him. Stout made a note on his legal pad and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, and the night of the traffic stop, why did you really pull her over? Ray was quiet for a long time. Because something was off, he said finally. I didn't know what. Did Prout know she was in the area? Ray thought about that. He thought about whether there had been a text, a call, anything. He was almost certain there hadn't been. He would have remembered. No, he said. So it was coincidence. I don't know what it was. He meant that. He still didn't know. He had pulled over a woman doing exactly the speed limit because something nagged at him, and the thing that nagged at him had been, if he was honest with himself in the privacy of a bad night, that she was alone and careful and didn't look like she belonged there. And he had thought she was lying about being FBI because the credential didn't fit with any narrative he could construct for what she was doing on that road. And he had processed her through the system because procedure was procedure, and also, somewhere below all of that, because the authority to do so was his and the authority to do so was what he had. None of which Stout needed to hear in detail. On August 14th, 36 days after the traffic stop, a federal grand jury in Tulsa returned indictments in connection with Operation Dry Creek. The indictments named 19 individuals. Gerald Prout was among them, charged with money laundering, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, and obstruction of justice. Ray Cullen's name was on the list. The charges against Ray were conspiracy to obstruct justice, bribery of a public official, and one count of civil rights violation relating to the unlawful detention of a federal officer in the performance of her duties. The last charge carried a potential sentence of 1 year, which was, in the context of the other charges, the smallest of his concerns. The arrest was not dramatic. It did not happen at the substation and it did not happen at his house. It happened at 9:40 a.m. on a Tuesday in the parking lot of a Brown's restaurant on Main Street in McAlester, where Ray had agreed to meet with Stout, and where instead 2 FBI agents in plain clothes were waiting beside a bureau vehicle when he pulled in. One of them was a man Ray hadn't seen before, young, dark-haired, who read him his rights with the particular practiced neutrality of someone who had done it 100 times. The other was Dana Marsh. She was in plain clothes, khakis, and a button-down, no jacket. She looked the same as she'd looked standing on the shoulder of US 270, the same measured attentiveness, the same hands. She didn't say anything during the arrest. She let her partner do the talking, and she stood to the side and watched Ray's face while he was read his rights, and if she was thinking anything specific, it wasn't visible. Ray looked at her. He looked at the handcuffs his wrists were being guided into, his hands in front of him, which was the same accommodation he'd made for her without quite knowing why. Then he looked at the parking lot a Tuesday morning in McAlester, a couple of teenagers with slushies watching from the sidewalk, an old man sitting in a truck with the window down who had watched the whole thing without any particular change of expression. Deputy Cullen, Dana said. It was the first time she'd spoken. He looked at her. Your attorney has been notified. That was all she said. The young agent guided Ray by the elbow toward the bureau vehicle, and Dana walked to the passenger side, and the door closed, and they pulled out of the parking lot and onto Main Street, and the teenagers watched them go, and the old man in the truck went back to whatever he'd been reading. The booking process at the federal building in Tulsa took several hours. Ray was processed with the particular thoroughness of a federal intake: fingerprints, photographs, property inventory, medical screening, a review of his rights that a federal public defender conducted in a small gray room that smelled like recirculated air. The property inventory took his watch, his wedding ring, his wallet, his keys, his belt. The items were placed in a clear plastic bag and sealed and labeled. Ray watched the booking officer handle the bag with the same detachment he'd always brought to doing this to other people. And he noticed, in a way he hadn't before, that the detachment was a professional skill, not indifference, the practiced neutrality of someone who understood that the items in the bag had a weight that had nothing to do with their physical properties. He was assigned a cell in the federal detention facility in Tulsa, which was a different experience from the Pittsburgh County substation in ways that were mostly architectural but also weren't. The cell was cleaner and quieter and more efficiently designed, and the people who staffed it moved through their duties with a bureaucratic precision that he recognized from his own work, and that now felt, from this side of it, like a different species of the same thing. He lay on the bunk that first night and looked at the ceiling and thought about his son at Oklahoma State, who studied agricultural economics and who would see this on his phone before morning, and about his wife in Krebs, who would probably find out from her sister before anyone in the family called her. He thought about Dale Whitfield, who had driven to the substation in the middle of the night because one of his deputies had done something that didn't feel right, and who had released Dana Marsh with an apology and a paperwork trail that had, in the end, helped build the case against the deputy he'd been trying to manage. He thought about Gerald Pruitt, who had been arrested 3 days earlier and whose lawyer, Stout had told him, was already in discussions with the prosecution about a cooperation agreement that would not, Stout had further told him, leave much daylight for the people lower on the food chain. He thought about the warehouse, the 2 vehicles he'd let pass, the texture of the $200 in cash the first time, folded inside a Whataburger bag which had struck him at the time as almost theatrical in its low-rent anonymity, and which he had told himself meant the whole thing was small, that the smallness of the package defined the smallness of the act. He didn't sleep much. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for September 8th. Stout came to the facility 3 times in the intervening weeks, and during those meetings they worked through the charges and the likely evidence and the basic architecture of what the government was going to do. The civil rights charge, the detention of Dana Marsh, was, Stout told him, strategically interesting from the prosecution's perspective because it was documented with unusual precision. The body cam footage, the booking records, the phone records showing the call to the field office and the 12-minute gap before Ray drove to the substation, Kowalski's contemporaneous notes from the duty log. There was also, Stout told him, A declaration from Special Agent Marsh that was about 4 pages long and that was written in the specific, compressed, documentary language of a federal agent's official statement, which meant every word in it was going to hold up and none of them were going to be sympathetic. Did she know, Ray asked, that night about me specifically? Stout paused. That's not information I have access to. But you could guess. I don't guess. Ray thought about the way she'd looked at him from the back of the cruiser. The expression that wasn't fear and wasn't anger. He thought about the fact that she had been, at that point, 6 weeks deep into a county that she had specifically been selected to work because she understood the institutional relationships in small rural jurisdictions. He thought about how thorough the Dry Creek investigation was, how long it had been running, how many individuals it had touched. He thought about her telling him in the parking lot of the Browns that his attorney had been notified, the ordinary professional courtesy of it. He didn't know, he was still not sure he wanted to. Gerald Pruitt entered a cooperation agreement in October. The agreement required him to provide testimony and documentation relating to 31 months of financial activity and 11 separate individuals, one of whom was Ray. The documentation Pruitt provided included bank records, text messages, including 16 messages between Pruitt and Ray's personal cell phone, the most recent of which was a message from Ray sent 3 weeks before the traffic stop, and which contained a license plate number followed by the single word clear, and 4 separate cash payments that Pruitt had with some foresight documented with photographs and date stamps. Pruitt's lawyer was, in fact, good. Pruitt's testimony was going to be valuable. Pruitt was going to do time, but not the kind of time that Gerald Pruitt, 61 years old with a heart condition and a comfortable house in McAlester, was going to find impossible to survive. When Stout told Ray about the text messages, Ray nodded once and looked at the table. The license plate, Stout said, one of the vehicles from the warehouse. Yeah. The night of August 2nd. I don't remember the specific. The agents do, Stout said not unkindly. Ray put both his palms flat on the table. Stout let the silence sit for a moment, then said, I want to talk about what we have to offer. What they had to offer was not, in the end, very much. Ray knew Pruitt's operation only at the edges, the license plates, the occasional property complaint redirected away from a relevant address, the cash he'd received. He didn't have the network's architecture, he didn't have names above Pruitt. He had cooperated in a low-level, peripheral way that had been useful to the network precisely because of its invisibility, its smallness, and that same smallness now limited his value as a cooperating witness. He had one thing, a property storage unit on the east side of Hartshorn registered to a company name that he had passed twice while working and had been told by Pruitt in explicit terms to leave alone. He didn't know what was in it. He suspected, given everything that he could reasonably guess, he had its address. Stout relayed this to the prosecution. The storage unit was searched under a warrant on November 3rd and found to contain approximately 60 pounds of methamphetamine in commercial packaging, along with $240,000 in cash, and a laptop with extensive documentation of the distribution network's operations that the Dry Creek case agents would later describe as the single most valuable piece of evidence in the entire investigation. None of this significantly altered the charges against Ray. What it did do was move the needle on sentencing, which was the only thing left to move. The plea agreement was entered on December 12th. Ray pled guilty to conspiracy to obstruct justice and 1 count of bribery of a public official. The civil rights charge was dropped in connection with the agreement, which Stout had considered a reasonable outcome given the alternative. The sentencing hearing was in March of the following year. The federal courthouse in Tulsa was not a dramatic building. It was the kind of utilitarian federal architecture that communicated competence rather than grandeur, pale stone and wide corridors, and the particular quiet of a building that takes its own authority for granted. Ray came in wearing a suit that Stout had suggested, charcoal gray, and sat at the defense table and looked at the seal on the wall behind the judge's bench and at the court reporter and at the wood paneling that was different from Stout's wood paneling, cleaner, less personal. The gallery was thin. A few people he didn't know, press, probably, and his son, who had driven down from Stillwater and was sitting in the 3rd row with the particular set to his jaw that Ray recognized as the face his son made when he was working very hard not to feel something. His wife was not there. They had filed in February, which was mutual and uncomplicated and had involved less conversation than most of the decisions they'd made during their marriage. The prosecutor spoke for 11 minutes. She was a woman in her early 40s, compact and precise, and she referenced the Dry Creek investigation and the storage unit and the text messages and the pattern of accommodation over 31 months. She didn't raise her voice. She used the word corrupted once in relation to the investigative environment in Pittsburgh County and then moved on. Stout spoke for 7 minutes about Ray's 11 years of service and his cooperation in locating the storage unit and his lack of prior criminal history. He was measured and professional, and Ray listened to it without any particular feeling. It was accurate as far as it went, and it was what a lawyer was supposed to say, and it sounded to his ear like what it was, the true parts of a larger story. Ray was sentenced to 42 months in federal prison and 3 years of supervised release. His law enforcement certification in Oklahoma was permanently revoked. He stood when the sentence was read, and he stood when the judge departed, and he sat back down and looked at the table while Stout gathered papers and spoke quietly about logistics and next steps and the specific facility where he'd likely be assigned. From the third row, Ray could feel his son watching him. He didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the table, on the grain of the wood, on the particular angle of light from the high windows that fell across the surface and illuminated nothing. Dana Marsh was in Tulsa when the sentencing happened. She had submitted her declaration in October and had testified before the grand jury in November and had done neither of those things at the sentencing hearing, which was procedurally unremarkable and which didn't require her presence. She was working another case. She had been working it since late January, a wire fraud investigation involving a residential real estate network in the Tulsa metro area, which was a different kind of work from Dry Creek but involved some of the same basic mechanics: the patient accumulation of documented discrepancy, the slow building of a record that could support what you already understood to be true. She was in the parking lot of a storage facility on the south side of Tulsa, in a different car, watching a woman who didn't know she was being watched. She had a coffee that had gone cold and a camera and a notebook, and the afternoon was gray and cold in the way that March in Oklahoma is often gray and cold, a flat low sky with the quality of a held breath. She knew about the sentencing. Kowalski had texted her that morning, Cullen, 42 months. She had thought about that for a moment and then put her phone face down on the passenger seat. The woman in the storage facility came out carrying a box and walked to a white Lexus. Dana picked up the camera. The light was flat, unhelpful but adequate. She took the photographs. In November, 8 months after sentencing, Ray was at a federal correctional institution in Segoville, Texas, which was a low-security facility with a campus-like layout and work assignments, and a daily schedule that had the quality of a routine that had been imposed from the outside and that he was gradually, without deciding to, making his own. He worked in the facility's grounds maintenance crew, which meant mornings outside, which was something. The Texas landscape around Segoville was flat and wide open in a way that felt different from Pittsburgh County, less enclosed, the horizon a long, unbroken line. He had never spent much time in Texas and had no particular feeling about it. He had been assigned a counselor, as all inmates were, and he met with her once a week in a small office that smelled like coffee and printer paper. Her name was Janine, and she was a practical woman who was not interested in catharsis for its own sake and who asked direct questions and tolerated direct answers. She had asked him once early on what he thought had been the turning point, the specific moment when the thing that eventually happened had become possible. Ray had thought about it. "I don't know that there was one," he said. "It was more like I kept deciding it was still small, that it hadn't gotten to a size that mattered yet." Janine had nodded and written something and not said anything, which was, he'd come to understand, her specific way of indicating that this was a useful answer. He wrote to his son every 3 weeks, which was the rhythm that had established itself without them deciding on it. His son wrote back, and the letters were short and not easy, but they were there. There was nothing in them that resembled what Ray had hoped for from fatherhood, but there was a thread, and the thread was currently intact, and he did not take that for granted. He thought about Dana Marsh sometimes, not with any particular feeling that he could name, more the way you think about a thing that changed the shape of something, an event that had a before and an after built into it. He thought about her sitting in the back of his cruiser with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the tree line, and the particular quality of the expression she'd worn, which he understood now, with the distance of months, had been the expression of someone doing a job while something inconvenient happened around them. He didn't think she had known about him specifically that night. He thought she had been on her way from a surveillance position to wherever she was staying in McAlester, and that a Pittsburgh County deputy had pulled her over because something about her driving nagged at him, and that she had been trained and experienced enough to do exactly what she had done: identify herself, request appropriate procedure, decline to provide information about her work, and sit with her eyes on the tree line and wait for the thing to be over. She had not been afraid of him. That was the thing he kept coming back to, in the particular long way that incarcerated time gives you for coming back to things. She had sat in his custody in an 8x10 cell in a facility run by a system that she probably had come to understand in her particular way could not be trusted to operate cleanly, and she had not been afraid. Not because she had known how it would end. Because she had understood all along what it was. Outside the window of his unit, the November sky over Seagoville was the same flat, pressureless gray it had been all week, the horizon line unbroken, the light going in the late afternoon with the slow finality of something that knows its own schedule and keeps it. A work crew was finishing up near the fence line. One of the men was raking leaves into a pile with a systematic patience that had a rhythm to it, a small efficiency, the kind of work that produces nothing permanent and still gets done. Ray watched until the light was gone, and then he turned away from the window.